Just word of warning here, I'm going to be focusing on the United States. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that, there is another transatlantic relationship, and that's with Canada. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. Truth in advertising here. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm a little intimidated by the size of the crowd because 5 o'clock in the evening talking about transatlantic relations. And please don't check your Twitter feed because I don't want to be contradicted by anything that's been tweeted out over the next couple of days. So my comment is the rise of a populist conservative nationalism in the United States has generated a lot of unease abroad. And so riding this populist wave, Trump has achieved the presidency advocating this hardline nationalist approach that's led to an American first agenda. And that's been really sort of the withdrawal or the repudiation of a lot of material and security interests of the United States. That's across issues, as you know, from climate change to arms control to nuclear cooperation to trade rules. And it's generated a lot of discussion about how this Trump administration is trying to sideline long-standing liberal institutions. And it's placing a lot more stress on bilateral deals based on a stricter and much more direct reciprocity than the traditional reliance on multilateralism. So it seems that Trump lacks faith in this strategic and normative utility of US alliances in the transatlantic relationship. He often expresses concern about burden sharing or trade deficits with the EU, and there is a sense that the US protection has to be paid in tangible benefits. In other words, he wants to extract rents from the European allies. And so there's a sense that this is different, and the foreign policy positions on all of these issues depart from this liberal internationalist tradition that has been prevalent in US foreign policy since the 1945. Do not get me wrong, the US-EU transatlantic relationship has often had conflicts over objectives historically. We can look at Willy Brandt and his Ostpolitik and the sort of concern that the US had about détente. We can talk about differences on the Israeli-Palestinian two-state solution, the differences of views, and also the US invasion of Iraq. But some observers are saying the fundamental structures and operating assumptions of the transatlantic relationship are being called into question. And some have even sort of said the EU or Europe should enter the breach. You have a new leadership here in the EU, and because the EU is a creature of the liberal order, you have an existential stake in preserving it. And so I think, though, that the rise of geopolitical competition between the major powers that has been intensifying during the past decade has meant that we have this state-to-state competition as a paradigm of international relations. And as a result of that, does the EU be the outlier, being a misfit in terms of not having a traditional state international relations paradigm? And so what I think has evolved in this relationship transatlantically is two different liberal orders. So the first one is a security order, and that's typically asymmetric and hierarchical. And that one, the security order, I would conceptualize as one of dependent development. And so that's, with the junior partner being Europe. The second liberal order is a market order. And here, I think this one is much more liberal, it's rule-based, and I would say that this one is more symmetrical, and it's based on sort of a conceptualization of both of them have market power, and both of them have been involved in competitive liberalization. So there's a general sense we have a rupture of interests and ideas in this transatlantic relationship. And the question we're asking, is this relationship frayed? And is the multilateral institutions built by both of them broken? So my first comment would be, the first comment is, how different is Trump? that's the sort of question we're all asking ourselves. And I would say that, anybody who does transatlantic relations would look back, buy a textbook, look at a title of an article, and over the last 4 decades, we've talked about the transatlantic relationship as one of volatility, as one of drift, as one of rupture, as one of adjustment. Crises are a constant feature in this relationship. The real question is whether the Trump administration's attitude towards Europe is different in substance than previous administrations. And so European perceptions have certainly changed. You once saw Europe or the US as a reliable partner, and now that seems to be cast into doubt. Public opinion has really, really shifted. And the image of the United States and the concern in Europe is about the highly conditional rhetorical backing for the transatlantic relationship. And that's really, really of concern. And so here I see that. What I want to sort of promote and try and articulate and hope you'll push back on is that so far we've got this anti-alliance presidential rhetoric and a pro-alliance administration policy that's papered over those rifts. So I think Europeans should not be surprised by American material interests. They shouldn't be concerned about that, because if you look at the United States, there's been sort of a continuation in policy. Americans have always had a sort of confidence in the stability of markets. They've also rejected a lot of restraints on their sovereignty. And they've also had a willingness to intervene unilaterally, and that was evident whether you look at the first Reagan administration, whether you look at the Bush administration, or you even see elements of it in the current Republican Party. And so from my perspective, given what we're seeing, I was really struck by this, which also indicates that Americans really still believe they have a role to play in international affairs. And I would not have predicted this kind of level of American public engagement. So my comment is really, is Trump really different? And I want to sort of put it in terms of 4 issues and put it out there for you. The first one is NATO burden sharing. The substance of US policy towards NATO is not dissimilar to prior administrations. Burden sharing dates back to the 1960s. You look at the congressional record in the 1960s and you will see elements of the need for burden sharing. So it's an old debate. The rhetoric is a departure from past practice, but I think that, lambasting NATO as an obsolete alliance or the EU as the biggest foe on trade, but the bifurcated European response to Trump's policy, praising the substance, decrying the rhetoric, has, if anything, grown clearer. And so I think the substance of US engagement with NATO remains strong. The Trump administration accelerated requests for the European Deterrence Initiative, which began under the Obama administration. And so military exercises continue as well. And so while the United States is pushing for more expenditure, I think the substance of this policy goes in line with previous US administrations. If you look at Secretary of Defense Mattis's concerns, you can also go back to former Defense Secretaries of Ash Carter and Robert Gates, who both served Democratic and Republican, and they constantly express concern of Allied free riding. That's my first comment. Having said that, Congress has also tried to provide reassurances in the past 3 years, especially on Article 5 commitments to NATO. And they actually passed something called CAATCA, C-A-A-T-C-A, or the Mendez Bill on Russian sanctions, countering American adversaries acts. That led to some complications because of the fallout for EU member states and companies. And Congress, especially the Senate Foreign Relations and the banking committees, have tried to work with EU partners to minimize the damage to European interest. But since the EU economic relationship with Russia is larger than the US, some collateral damage is inevitable. So my first issue is NATO burden sharing. Is it different? My second issue is that the distrust of European strategic autonomy. Europeans have visions of strategic autonomy, and that was sort of a little bit designed to push back against the United States. So far, the goals do not match the reality of Macron's notion of strategic autonomy, and that Europe has the capacity to defend itself. But even such tentative proposals from Macron and others about strategic autonomy are fueling skepticism, if not opposition, in Washington. Again, this is not new, as there's a perennial distrust of such European initiatives, and American policymakers would prefer Europeans spend more on military power within the confines of NATO, not siphon off from the effectiveness of NATO. And I would say Madeleine Albright epitomized it most, particularly under the Clinton administration, and she said, we do not want 3Ds. We do not want the EU, we do not want decoupling, duplication, or discrimination. So in other words, we don't want duplication of assets, we don't want discrimination against non-NATO allies, and we do not want decoupling from NATO. So it's an issue that evolved in the 1990s. Again, strategic autonomy is not new. The third issue is trade barriers and protectionism. Trump has a very transactional approach to international relations. It's configured around either allied defense spending or the terms of trade. So on top of this, he sharpened this effort to link US-European economic relations with US security guarantees, particularly in his rallies. He does not like trade deficits with European member states, and it's led him to tweet. I'm only going to do one tweet. It's led him to tweet. On top of this, the European Union has big trade barriers on US goods. No, we protect Europe, which is good, at great financial loss. And then we unfairly are clobbered on trade. Change is coming. No. That's my no. In criticism of European trade barriers and protectionism is not new. We can go back to the Kennedy administration and the initial GATT rounds and concern about common agricultural policy. We can also go back to the European single market in the 1980s, when Americans talked about Fortress Europe, and they talked about concerns of getting market access into the EU and fear they were going to be shut out of the European single market. And so that is an issue where I think they are also seemingly far apart is in the United States. We're very concerned about market fundamentalism, the primacy of the market. And in Europe, you tend to talk about social solidarity, trade for all in your trade documents, an ever closer union. It's a very different language and discourse. But the market fundamentalism has led, Trump to be very critical of your competition and antitrust commissioner, and to talk about, the problems with Apple and Google and so forth, and how they are being unfairly treated within the EU. Interestingly enough, the US is shifting to the same position at the state level within Congress, and they have the same concerns now about tech monopolies and power in the EU. And so my last point would be, fourthly, indifference and diplomatic engagement. I put it a pluralization of democracy. There's a sense that diplomatic engagement with the European Union has shifted in the current administration. But I would like to remember that Obama followed George W. Bush in both experiencing and causing disappointment in the transatlantic relationship. When President George Bush withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, it mirrors Trump's withdrawal from the climate treaty. And so Europeans were concerned very much by Obama's failure to move forward on closing Guantanamo Bay in the United States, the increased reliance on targeted killings via drone strikes, or the handling of private data by US and EU authorities. And Jeremy Shapiro and Nick Whitney wrote, Obama is best viewed as being unsentimental and instrumentalist in his view on Europe and other partners. We use the term transactional for Trump, but we had a same sort of analysis of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration's pivot towards Asia and the Trans-Pacific Partnership caused a lot of concern in Europe and was a key factor in pushing Europeans to promote a free trade agreement with the United States, the much failed TTIP negotiations. That said, having tried to make the case of continuation of substance in some areas, there is a focus in this administration on individual member states as the primary interlocutor on a number of issues. The President and Secretary Pompeo have both given clear examples. They see the relationship with Europe, not the EU writ large. The strident example was Secretary Pompeo's speech in Brussels in December 2018 when he called into question whether the EU was acting in member states' interests. That reflects a nationalist conservative perspective towards the generally, and the notion that they would like to work with like-minded partners in Europe. Those like-minded partners in Europe, you can probably figure out who they are. And within this administration, the US has launched something called a Commission on Inalienable Rights. What that is it's looking at human rights. And it actually stems from a perspective of the founders of the US Constitution. And instead of making human rights situational, like the right to protect, it is focused on fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property, the old US founding principles. I don't know how influential this new perspective will be, but it has kinship to Hungarian and Polish Christian nationalism. There's no talk about democracy promotion from this administration. That, in a sense, is undermining one of the foundations of the liberal order. A second issue is the disillusionment with economic globalization and free trade. And given the dynamics of exclusion and the sense that globalization has not given everybody significant dividends, and there's sort of a resentment of a good portion of voters in the United States, I think that the politics of the moment suggest it will be really difficult to build support for a policy of free trade and also sort of, again, undermining an element of the liberal order. You might talk about it as almost like disembedded liberalism. And so with that, I sort of said, okay, so I'm a little concerned about all of these issues. So what does it mean for how the transatlantic relationship operates? I'm trying to argue that the substance, there's continuity, but I recognize that the rhetoric is different and European attitudes and perceptions are of concern. Transatlantic relations now is navigating within a polarized system or a polarized system of transatlantic governance. There are policy divergences on a wide range of regional and global issues. It's challenging US-European relations. But with that, foreign policy is very, very fragmented across both institutions and policies in the United States. There's a willingness to look at European governance. When you study the EU, you study it in terms of interinstitutional relations, the Council, the Commission, the Parliament. Or you might study vertically between member states and the EU. And yet, when we think about that, we're so focused on the executive or the White House in transatlantic relations, we're not looking at the multiplicity of foreign policy and how it takes place and the various interests and veto points in the United States. So I want to think about the organizational structure and bureaucratic politics that is really being transformed in the United States, and how does that impact transatlantic relations? So my first comment would be, how do we operate in this system of transatlantic governance, given what's going on? I want to sort of muddy up the waters of US foreign policy machinery, bureaucratic politics. The first one is, I think we have a transatlantic regulatory space. I think that we have experienced an engagement and an expansion of regulatory agencies over the past couple of decades, recognizing that we now engage, to use Mark Pollack and Schaefer's term, on a transgovernmental, transnational basis. Not all transatlantic relations is high politics. Not all of it, to use Hoffman's term. Some of it is much more low-key. Container safety, terrorist financing, privacy shield, mergers and acquisitions, and it also engages new actors in the United States. The Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Aviation Authority, the Homeland Security. That creates a much more plurality of transgovernmental links and actors. That's less politicized, that's less controversial, but it's the day-to-day politics of transatlantic relations. The second thing that I would like to muddy the waters of US foreign policy for the transatlantic relationship is the role of Congress and its ability to constrain the policy options of any US president. It's an absolute understudied issue in transatlantic relations, and it will play an even more important role in the future. Interinstitutional relations matter in the United States. And part of that is the role of the interagency process among all of the, when you have a framing of transatlantic policy, there is an interagency process with multiple players coming to the table. That clearly broke down over the Ukraine. But nearly all major outputs of foreign policy require formal congressional role, whether it's agency authorization, whether it's budgets, whether it's treaties. The only thing that does not require a congressional role is executive agreements. So we can't ignore the increased politicization over the past 3 decades. We can't ignore the sort of how that's affected the congressional role in foreign policy. Sure, it's more difficult to get bipartisan support for an ambitious or risky undertaking, particularly the use of military force and the conclusion of treaties. What that means in terms of power and the transatlantic relationship is we've seen over the Clinton, Bush, Obama administration a shift to executive orders and executive agreements. Why is that significant? That means they're using informal mechanisms to promote transatlantic relations and not formal agreements. What that also means, and I would argue, is it is multilateralism by stealth. As a result of that, you don't have credibility. You don't have credible commitments, and it can be absolutely reversed. So consider the Iran nuclear deal. In 2015, Barack Obama came to my university and gave one speech on the Iran deal. And that he was trying to push forward, and he could not get that treaty passed with Iran through a Republican-controlled Congress. He chose to make it an executive agreement. So it was very easy for Trump to withdraw from that commitment. He's not the only one. If you look at the International Criminal Court, Bush didn't want it, but he wanted it for Darfur. Anti-personnel mines, the US didn't want it because of North Korea, but they were willing to think about it elsewhere. So there are a number of ways, if you look back at past presidents, they have used executive agreements, but they don't get institutionalized. They're very easy to reverse, which is what has happened with the Iran deal. My next point is the US and EU are engaging in a transatlantic relationship which is markedly different on both sides. The EU you consider as a normative power. What I think has been happening in the United States is the growth of a national security state. As a result of that, the US Department of State has steadily ceded authority over the implementation of foreign policy to other agencies and over foreign policy formulation to the National Security Council in the White House. What's even more striking is the Pentagon regularly and directly engages in diplomacy. Diplomacy with foreign leaders to an extent we have no parallels in US history. And it's not just about military occupation or conflict zones. It's a range of non-traditional tasks. You might call it civilian-military relations here. So for the EU, the State Department was where they engaged on foreign relations, the US Trade Representative on trade. But now you have to engage with the Treasury on the digital tax issue, Homeland Security on Privacy Shield, the Justice Department on antitrust. So you have to engage multiple players with multiple veto points. How has the EU responded? You're no longer just sending diplomats in terms of foreign policy. You're also sending specialists in all of these sectoral areas. So I would argue it's now multi-level and multi-sectoral. And so with that, my last point would be, you're all willing to consider the EU in terms of multi-level governance. You have to see the United States in terms of multi-level governance, in terms of vertical. States matter in the US, but they matter in a much more important way than we are talking about in the transatlantic relationship. The US states do not have a role in trade negotiations. They are not the Canadian provinces. They are not the Mexican states. But they are important for the implementation of a free trade agreement. Most of the barriers that the EU wants to remove in a trade agreement with the United States are subnational. Services, subnational. Insurance, subnational. Any of the market barriers that you want access to are typically at the subnational level. If you want access to a procurement market, 80% of it is state and local. That's where the market access is. But the US is very clever. It does not allow the states to sit at the table. Why? Because they are worried that divergent preferences, but also collective action. So this is called paradiplomacy. And the external relations of the states have been very curtailed by the Supreme Court in the United States. So we don't talk about, in transatlantic relations or foreign policy, the role of US states having a foreign policy. But it's the US states and the cities that are designing new social and environmental regulatory schemes. They're the ones that the free trade agreements are intruding on, and their concerns about what if we have a free trade agreement with labor or environmental rights or data privacy or corruption or anything else, what if it conflicts with our subnational jurisdiction? And what's happening is, hard as this is to believe, but some states opt out of a free trade agreement. if I compared several of the free trade agreements we have in the United States, sometimes there's 27 states signed on board, sometimes there's 32. Could you imagine you have a free trade agreement and today Belgium drops out of a US one, but Germany drops out of a Canadian one? You wouldn't actually do that in terms of, but that means your transatlantic relationship now has to think about the state subnational level. But on the other hand, not only are states concerned about any encroachment on their sovereignty, their regulatory sovereignty, but on the other hand, states are the laboratories of democracy. Many initiatives that resonate with the EU, with European goals, are state-driven. And so the Climate Alliance is a coalition of 23 states. It makes up 50% of the US population, and it makes up 50% of EU GDP. So your engagement transatlantically on climate is going to be at the city and subnational level. If we want to look at genetically modified foods, they are banned in certain states in the United States. And of course, the food industry is not very happy. But the point being, you have values and narratives and ideas and prescriptions that are actually emerging at the subnational state level. And so the final issue is Macron now is looking at sanctions on the digital tax. And I think it is discriminatory. It is designed to exclude Chinese and American companies. It'll probably go to the WTO. He'll probably get slapped with tariffs. But guess what? 27 states have taxed digital products. There's no common conception of what digital products are in the United States. Hypocrisy, yes. But they have varying rates. There's no homogeneous digital tax. And so that's, again, the states are doing things that resonate with the EU. And my final one is that where is the contestation over tech monopolies coming from? Where are the concerns about the anti-competitive behavior of Google or Facebook or Amazon? It's coming at the state level. State attorney generals are taking on a lot of these companies. And that puts them in line with EU competition policy and antitrust. So from that point of view, I think we need to reconfigure how we think about, the broader transatlantic lens, multi-level, multi-sectoral, intergovernmental, transgovernmental, cross-cutting cleavages, vertical and horizontal in terms of coordination and contestation. So the last comment that I would raise here is that, I also put this up. It's my colleague Jordan Tima's comment about bipartisan alignments in foreign policy. For all the images that we are getting, there's still a substantial cross-partisanship in foreign policy actions. These are not all transatlantic, but 40% are cross-partisan. The second area is strong bipartisan agreement, which is more than 10% of the other party. And if you look, strong polarization is on a very small area of foreign policy. So I do think we need to take account of that, in our discussions. And I'll make two final comments. So widen the lens, widen the actors, widen the win sets. And so does the liberal order have the same effectiveness and viability? If the EU faced some common challenges across transatlantic governance, how do they resolve? Where do they diverge? And where do they converge? I think there are differences on threat assessment in terms of security and economic issues, and that's generated different policy approaches. And I will use just two examples. Trade. Obviously, the trade relationship is very, very important, trade and investment between the US and EU. Any talk you get given by a diplomat will always start off with the statistics and figures of a balanced trade and investment relationship. I'm not a diplomat. I don't have to do that. And so, but I'm going to think about trade in a different way. Trade has been transformed And trade has been transformed, and its impacts on the international system has, in terms of principles, policies, even mandates, has changed. We no longer talk about trade in terms of tariffs, we talk about it in terms of non-tariff barriers. We don't talk about trade in terms of manufacturing, we talk about trade in forms of services. And so it appears that the US and EU were moving forward and pushing new directions in trade, new commitments in services, focusing on the production of global supply chains, and the obstacles were about non-tariff barriers. And the transatlantic relationship spent the last 20 years talking about regulatory alignment, rule alignment, removing non-tariff barriers. And so all of a sudden, there's been a shift in what the US sees as an obstacle to trade. It's about protecting domestic producers from foreign competition through tariffs. So it's almost like the US has an old view of trade and the EU has a new view of trade. And so that results in the fact that the US and EU differ in their attitudes towards free trade agreements and multilateralism. The EU is a trading state. It centers its international activity on multilateral rules and institutions, and it's obviously generated a lot of bilateral free trade agreements with different partners, with the notable exception of the United States. And what's interesting is trade for all, multiple trade agreements, Vietnam, Singapore, Mexico, Canada, pick your country. But then you look at the United States, and the United States, since it signed the US-Canadian trade deal, the precursor to NAFTA, has only signed 14 free trade agreements. Canada has signed 44, and the EU is probably up there matching it. And so the United States is becoming on the sidelines as a rule maker and a standard setter for the global economy. And so despite this, the US and EU, in terms of trade diplomacy, conducting a free trade agreement, are now engaging in something that I would call TTIP light. What it is they have highly divergent mandates. The US has put forward they want market access on agriculture. The EU has talked about tariffs and industrial goods. The problem for the EU is many of its preferred trade asks are at the subnational level, and they are off the table. And the other problem is US negotiation efforts have stalled with China, the USMCA, they're moving on Japan, while the EU has concluded them. So what we have had is a shift from a pattern of the 1990s. In the 1990s, it was a pattern of competitive liberalization. The EU had an agreement with Korea. The US had an agreement with Korea. And they had that competitive liberalization. So now the US is touting bilateral deals to reduce trade deficits. So the US has sharply reoriented its trade strategy. So Trump's policies are reminiscent of the managed trade practices of the 1980s. China has become Japan of the 1980s. And so the US strategy, he sees it, Trump, as a zero-sum competition. Protectionism is a pathway to prosperity. So China's become the new Japan. And so I was thinking to myself, is Trump really different? He's diverging from the multilateralism and liberalization of the EU, but if you think about it, the United States has always unilaterally exercised material power. August 1971, the Nixon shock, dollar devaluation, eroding the gold standard, putting a 10% surcharge or tariff on imports. Not dissimilar to Trump's policy. 1980, 1981, a voluntary export restraint to stop Japanese auto imports. Same response they want towards Germany. Same playbook. They're old-fashioned and they predate, the WTO, but he's doing these similar trade practices. So on the one hand, is the trade mantra diverging or converging? The second area that maybe they're converging or diverging is perhaps, and this is my final point, is that are they converging or diverging? And here you might choose Chinese foreign direct investment. And here, you know, Europeans post-financial crisis were really interested in attracting Chinese foreign direct investment. Some European states even decided to join the One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's been very, very divisive in Europe. But I think this is an area where they are now converging. And what I mean by that is the United States has always had a review of foreign direct investment for military and defense purposes. It has a very interesting view, and it's called CFIUS. Not Greek, not a Greek tragedy, but it's effectively an oversight for foreign direct investment. What happened is under previous administrations, it's always been militarily and tied to defense and security. They modernized that act last year, and now it includes tech companies. And now it means that there's more scrutiny of Silicon Valley, venture capital, and all of those other things. We've also seen an explosion of cases of scrutiny of foreign direct investment. Read a lot of this being Chinese or other foreign direct investment. What we've seen is sort of from a trickle of cases being denied to about 250 to 350 cases being scrutinized, and half of them under the Trump administration have been denied. What's interesting about this is Europeans looked at this model and have adopted their own soft model of scrutiny of Chinese foreign direct investment. It's less stringent. It gives a lot of more leeway to the nation state to decide what they would like to review or not. What I'm getting at here is that both sides have an interest in keeping open a digital economy, disseminating rules to basically ensure that there are not distortions through state-owned enterprises or state capitalism. They're worried about forced technology transfer. And so what it means here is that perhaps this is an area of convergence. Perhaps this is an area where they can actually do something together. So from that just semblance, I'm going to make 3 final points in the conclusion. Then you guys get to work. All right. The first one is, I think the Europeans seem to be waiting out the Trump administration. They're offering the semblance of a trade deal, limited in scope. They're trying to mitigate the effects of tariffs. Nothing like the ambitions of TTIP, not even like the ambitions going back to the Bush or Clinton administration on trade negotiations. But I don't know if that's a viable policy if there is a second term. But Europeans should expect differences to continue across U.S. foreign policy communities. The U.S. foreign policy community is still divided on issues like defense spending, sovereignty, and climate change. So what we're seeing here in the transatlantic relationship, what does this mean for the liberal order? I think we've both been so accepting that the US and EU basically provided transnational and public goods. And transnational and global public goods. We did work on climate, we did work on the environment, we did work here, there, we created the WTO and so forth, the GATT. So I think what you have now is 3 models. 1, private goods is the way the United States is operating. Public goods is how the EU as a normative power still tries to operate. And thirdly, club goods is when all of a sudden India, Russia, and China get together at the G7, you're starting to have exclusionary, exclusive club goods. So there are new institutions coming up, competing ideas, norms, and institutions that they are now in play, so there's a changing distribution of power. And as my colleague Amitar Acharya says, there's a range of other regional and plurilateral arrangements that is not the product of US leadership nor indebted to American leadership. with that, I would say transatlantic allies are going to have to come to terms with how this administration has broken pre-existing orthodoxies. It's opened up debate about the fundamentals of American foreign policy. That's your challenge for the transatlantic relationship. Thank you. Is it about the right time?
Thank you so much, Michelle.